We just traveled back in time. Thank you for joining me. Went back to the year 2003. I know many of you weren't born yet. I, however, was 34 years old, and I was an atheist. I didn't believe in God. I thought it was all made up. And in this year, something interesting did start happening. I started attending church. And for proof, I brought a picture. That is me in the back row. I always wanted to sit in the back row because I could come in late and I could leave early. That's my wife next to me. Here's the reason I was in church. I was only there to support her. She was moving in one direction towards God and Jesus. I was moving in another. And I wasn't happy about it. When I was in church, I'd usually be just daydreaming, not paying attention, thinking about what I'm going to do that day or something like that. But if I was paying attention, this is all a made-up story. It's wishful thinking. It grew over time. I was rather repulsed by it all, to be honest. Now we're going to go forward a few years here, 4 years actually. These are my kids, twins, boy and a girl. They were 6 years old at this time. And this is when I had a problem. I had to teach them right from wrong. I had to teach them good morals. And here's my problem. Now we're going to roll the clock back quite a bit farther. We're going to go back to 1989. That is me. Mr. Anti-Authority. I used alcohol, I used drugs, and I used girls, and I have a lot of regrets. So what am I going to do? If I tell them to do as I say but not as I did, then I'm a hypocrite. Do I use somebody else's standard of right and wrong? Well, that's just their opinion. And there's lots of opinions. So I've been going to church now for a few years, reluctantly, but still going, and hearing Jesus, hearing Christianity, and it did seem like there were some morals there, and if Jesus was God, then those would be the best morals, right? But I can't teach something I don't believe. My name is Rick Allen. I am a software architect. I work for Best Buy in the cities. I have some hobbies to share for a couple reasons. Number one, I'm proud that I did them. And number two, they shaped my presentation, particularly the last one. I was a firefighter and an emergency medical technician for a number of years, and I was a reserve sheriff deputy. And that law enforcement, I found really good analogies that really helped my journey. And also, probably the biggest thing is, I'm a skeptic. Not about just religion, but about everything. I question everything. I'm a second guesser. So that's what led me on a multi-year journey to investigate the evidence for God and Christianity, to say, is this true or not? Because as a skeptic, I'd never questioned that. I never questioned atheism. I never questioned what I believed. And it was time I did that. Now, I went into this journey thinking that the atheists were the honest ones. They were the ones using reason. They were the ones using science. People who believed in God, Christianity, they're biased. Maybe uneducated, maybe even deluded. I didn't know. So let me give you some examples of what I found. On the right side here, there's some atheists. Rather well known, if you know the atheists in those circles. Christopher Hitchens, he has passed away. He was a very, very strong atheist. Richard Dawkins, most people have heard of him. And Bill Nye the Science Guy is a strong atheist. But I found there were Christians that were on the other side that were really smart. First one's really interesting, Peter Hitchens. It's his brother. He's a Christian. We have Alistair McGrath, professor at Oxford as well, very smart. Douglas Act is extremely educated. Molecular biologist, believes in Christianity. Same thing on the celebrity side. Jarvis, by the way, is an atheist. Brad Pitt. Rhett and Link, just a show of hands. How many know Rhett and Link? Just give me an idea. About half. Okay. So they're social media, they're YouTube, they're really popular. And they deconstructed, they were strong Christians. And a couple years ago, they deconstructed it. At the end of the presentation, we'll talk some more about that. There's Christian celebrities, though, of course, as well. Chris Pratt, The Rock, and Carrie Underwood. This is Thomas Nagel. He is an atheist, respected professor at New York University. And he has a quote that I'm going to read that really sums up what happened. He says, "I want atheism to be true, and I'm uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers." Here's the thing. You can go to the internet and pretty much find anything you want to find to back what you want to believe. I decided that I needed to look at the evidence. I needed to make my own decision based on that evidence. And it's something I recommend you do as well. I started out looking at the evidence for God. If there's no God, there's no reason to look at anything else. We're not going to spend time to hear tonight, but just an overview. There's good evidence for God. There's design in life, DNA, and the machines that are in our bodies. There's a design in the world. Science is really uncovering a lot of things in the last 50 to 100 years in both of these areas. There is the supernatural. I believe it exists, and something's wrong, evil, and suffering. Actually, an argument for God. But we only have 45, 50 minutes here tonight. We're going to focus on Christianity. Is it fact or fiction? Okay, God exists. What about the religions? What about Christianity? I didn't think it was true. It was made up. It was a story that grew over time. We're going to talk about the Bible, particularly the New Testament. And we're going to look at facts. Are there facts in the Bible? Is it more fact or fiction? Should be pretty easy to look at it if we go into it with that mindset. And then, is it authentic? Has it grown over time? Is the story what was started back when Jesus lived? So the New Testament, something I really actually didn't know, is 27 history books put together. And you can look at each of these books as a history book in itself. And we're going to look at some things. Is it more fiction? Made up places, made up people, vague details? Or is it nonfiction? Real people, real places, explicit details. Again, it should be pretty easy. Let's take a look at what we find. Well, there is archaeology that confirms the Bible and the New Testament in particular. The things I listed here are actually archaeological finds that critics said they were wrong in the Bible before they found them. The Bible must have been wrong because we don't have any evidence of them. We're going to look at just a few of them. The first one is this term polytarchs in Acts. For years, critics said, no, they were adamant, there's no such title. So the Bible must have this wrong. And you'll hear this theme. No, they must be wrong. Well, in 1876, they found an inscription of polytarchs. And since 1988, they have found 64 more inscriptions of that term. So the Bible, turns out, was right. Pontius Pilate. No evidence of Pontius Pilate for many years. They found a stone, Caesarea Maritima, 1961, that labels not only Pontius Pilate, but it labels Tiberius as well. And Tiberius was the emperor when Pontius Pilate was around that time. So the time frame was correct as well. In addition, in 1968, they found a ring, but they couldn't decipher it. They really didn't know what it meant. This was found in south of Bethlehem. But in 2018, the methods to decipher things had improved, and they found that it actually references Pilate. And finally, there was no evidence of crucifixion, no archaeological evidence of crucifixion until 1968. And they found an ankle bone with a nail through it. Obviously, he was crucified. They think from probably the 70s is when the Jews and Jerusalem went on, that's probably when he was crucified. But here's what's even more interesting about this. They found it in a bone ossuary in a tomb, in a burial tomb, with 2 chambers and 12 burial niches. Why is that interesting because it shows that somebody who was crucified could be buried properly. Obviously, we know that story of Jesus. He was buried in a tomb afterwards, after his crucifixion. They estimate that only 20% of the Holy Land has actually been excavated. They can't excavate on the majority of it because things are built on it. So you can imagine what they might find. Craig Evans said, nothing has been found that contradicts what's reported in the Gospels. So we have real places confirmed by archaeology. We're going to take a little side loop here on archaeology of the New Testament, and we're going to talk about the Old Testament. We're going to talk about King David, because my understanding is you guys are learning some things about King David. So I thought it might be fun to look at some archaeology of King David. There is some. Now, he lived 1,000 years before Jesus, so there's not a lot. But there is some. They found a slingshot in King Tut's tomb. He died about 1300 BC, and it demonstrates that weapon was actually in use at that time. You're probably familiar with that story, David and Goliath. David was the king of Judah and the city of Hebron. And at this location, they found 5 jar handles, and they bear the city name Hebron. They think it might be David's royal residence, but this is one of the areas that's off limits to excavation, so they can't actually confirm anything. In Jerusalem, in 2005, they unearthed a monumental building complex made out of large stones. And they found pottery that dated to the time of King David. It very well may be his palace. We have the Mesha stele, which was dated to about 800 BC, discovered in 1868. And it records King Mesha of Moab's victories over Israel, but most importantly, it found the phrase in there, the house of David. That was in 1994. In 2019, the critics started saying, no, we don't think that's really what it says. But new technology again came out. They could do a 3D image of it, and they were able to confirm that, yes, it says House of David. And finally, the Tel Dan stele. 3 fragments of this stone. One was found in 93, 2 more was found in 94, dates to the 9th century. It describes the king of Aram's, his past victories, including victories over the king of the house of David. And this pretty much directly affirmed the existence of David. Okay, let's go back on the Christianity trail. And we talked about real places. Let's talk about real people. What do we see if we just look at it in terms of real people? Well, we see real names all over the place. But not only real names, you see the titles of these people. And you see where they're from. Pretty easy to see the names are real. Not going to spend much time there. Real people, real names. How about the details? Do we see vague details or do we see explicit details? Here's a map that Luke and Paul went on from Caesarea to Rome. How do you think they built this map? They drew the map. They were able to draw the map based on the details in Luke's writings. Explicit details, where they put in, how they sailed, along which coasts. They were able to create this map based on the details. He even talks about the winds. The prevailing winds made them sail in a certain way. And again, that's how they were able to build that map. This one's kind of interesting. We're going to unpack a little story. This is about the shipwreck that they had. And he says, about midnight, the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. Caught my attention. They suspected. Well, why did they suspect? Well, if you go back just a little bit, he said, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days. So it was cloudy, and it's midnight. They can't see the shore, but they probably could hear it. So they were suspecting it. So then he goes on to say they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. That's about 120 feet deep. A little farther, they found 15, 90 feet. So they're getting shallower. Also a sign that they're getting close to shore. They let down 4 anchors, prayed for the day to come. And then they cast those anchors off and left them in the sea. More archaeology here. They found 4 anchors in a location that matched these depths in the same place where they were. Now, unfortunately, those who found them didn't know what they had. 2 of them were lost. 1 of them was melted down. But there is a 4th one that's still in existence. And they have been able to inspect it and date it to the 1st century. So these are details. If it was nonfiction, I would kind of expect more like, well, we cast the anchors off and we swam into shore. But there's very, very details. And he says things like 276. Well, obviously, we don't know for sure if that's right or not, but it's not something you would normally say. You might say 250, there were 300, 276. And you see things like for 3 months, for 3 days, 1 day, 2nd day, 7 days. Very explicit details of what was going on. Luke and John both record medical conditions that at the time they didn't know. So Luke said his sweat became like drops of blood. It's kind of unusual. And when the spear went into Jesus' side, blood and water came out. Both odd. The early church fathers really struggled with these. Was it allegory? Was it symbolic? Well, medicine has advanced, and now we know these are actually medical conditions that can happen. Luke and John, they were just reporting what they saw. They weren't making it up. As a matter of fact, if they were making it up, you wouldn't expect them to say what they said. Geography, you can look at the cities they talk about. All these cities are confirmed, islands, plateaus, hills. Geography is really, really hard to fake, especially in those times. You've got to put yourself back in the 1st century. There weren't books around that you could read. There obviously wasn't the internet. You either lived there and you knew the geography, or you didn't. You couldn't write about geography in another part of the world. The government, how people were imprisoned, the Roman government, how you could appeal to Caesar, all of those things are in there. Plants, animals. I don't know if you know the sycamore tree, the fig tree, only grows in Israel and South Africa. Those 2 places. And again, I talked about if you didn't live there, you wouldn't know it. So it's one of those 2. Buildings, how buildings, this is details you wouldn't expect in nonfiction. How are the buildings put together? Customs like Passover and the Sabbath. We talk about the books that aren't in the Bible. Gospel of Thomas, some of those other ones. If you look at this criteria, nonfiction versus fiction, you're not going to see the details that you see in the books that are in the Bible. So, real places, real people, explicit details. But, okay, that's nonfiction. I'm on my journey here. I'm being Mr. Skeptic because that's who I am. But couldn't the story have grown over time? Especially those miracles. Kind of like the telephone game, right? We just pass things along and it just keeps growing and growing and growing over time. Big concern of mine. So, we're going to talk about this one a little bit. I'm going to start with a video that talks about something called textual criticism. And then we'll go over that just at a high level after the video.
Is today's New Testament the same as the original that was written 2,000 years ago? Or has the original been hopelessly lost? After all, not one of the original manuscripts still exists. If we can't trust the New Testament, we can't trust what we think we know about Jesus of Nazareth, and there's no such thing as authentic Christianity. Let's look at this more closely. The New Testament, and all significant literature from the ancient world, is reconstructed into its original form by comparing manuscript copies that have survived. To determine the reliability of this reconstruction, historians ask 3 questions. How many copies exist? How long is the time gap between when the original was written and when the earliest surviving copy was made? And how significant are the differences between the copies? The experts have more confidence in their reconstruction of the original text when there are lots of copies to work with. The time gap is short, and the differences are relatively insignificant.
So this is a discipline called textual criticism, and it's important, at least it was for me, to note that it's not just for the Bible. It's for any ancient literature. Whether you're talking about Homer or Iliad or any of those things, they're going to use the same kind of tests to determine how accurate they think the texts are that we have. So you have an original manuscript. Book of Luke, for example. Somebody had to write the first book. That's your original. And then you have manuscripts that get created, which is actually different than copies. Manuscripts mean they were written by hand, right? So back then they didn't have the technology, so they would write copied manuscripts by hand. And then more manuscripts would get copied and more would get copied. And that happened until about 1400 AD. That's when the printing press was invented. And now we don't have to copy things by hand, we can use machines to do it. So we have about 1400 years where these manuscripts were created. But they were created on fragile paper. They were lost in fires. There wasn't good storage methods. And so we lose them. We just don't have them. So there is 3 things the video talked about. How many copies? How many manuscripts? What's the time gap? And differences. So number 1 and 2 up here, how many copies do we have that still exist versus how many got lost? We don't know how many got lost, but we can tell how many we have. And how large is that time gap between when we think the original was written and the copies that we have? You'll have to take my word for it, 1 and 2, really good. Many, thousands and thousands more copies than other ancient literature. And the time gap is extremely short, especially when you get into the fragments. You're talking down to like 50 years. And some of this other literature in ancient, you're talking 1,000 years. So huge difference. But these things they didn't matter to me much in my journey as a skeptic, because they were just numbers. But number 3 was interesting to me. How significant are the differences? Because that's a telephone game, right? We have differences. This is Bart Ehrman. Some of you may have heard of him. He's fairly popular. Pretty smart guy. Been through master's and PhD. He wrote a book called Misquoting Jesus. And in that book, he talks about the differences. He actually says there are more differences amongst our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. That's pretty startling. Caught my attention for sure. Pretty powerful. The problem is, the criteria for number 3 is not how many differences there are, which is what Bart is calling out. It's how significant are the differences. That's what the criteria is. This is a crime scene analogy I use. If somebody got shot and they're on the ground, hurt obviously, the paramedics run in and they start trying to help this guy, revive this guy. Well, I don't know if you know this or not, but paramedics are messy. So they're going to have bandages all over the place. All this stuff's going to get messed in the crime scene. So the evidence has been tainted. Now the detectives don't come in and say, well, it's messy. We can't do anything with this. They don't. They clean it up and they take effort to remove the problems and then get at the evidence. You do the same thing here with the Bible. So I mentioned Bart. He actually, somebody else, his professor was Bruce Metzger. Very smart, taught Bart a lot of what he knows. The reason I'm bringing him up will be apparent in a minute. They were both Christians. Bruce has passed away. He was a Christian until the day he died. Bart became an atheist, primarily over the issues of evil and suffering, he'll say. But this is why I bring it up, because if you dig into the appendix of that book, you'll see this. The position I argue for does not actually stand at odds with Professor Metzger's position. Here's the point, that the essential Christian beliefs are not affected by the variants. So yes, there's differences, but only 1% of the differences affect any meaning at all. Most of them are punctuation differences. And none of them, as he's saying here, affect the core Christian doctrine. Like a crime scene, you can remove the artifacts and you're left with good evidence. And then I had what I call an aha moment. Scientists have actually done brain studies, and when you have an aha moment, that's why you get that kind of rush. Aha! I had this aha moment. Remember, I thought this was growing over time, legends kind of a thing. But I thought about this, and I'm like, well, if a scribe embellished something here at this point, then you would have maybe another scribe did something different over here, and someone did a little different something over here. Well, here's the problem. If you can see the problem, when you get to the end, you would expect wildly different stories, but you don't. They're very, very consistent. And all those nonfiction things I talked about, they stay. I mean, nonfiction would get corrupted with the stories if it grew over time. The telephone game is not selective. Okay, I've been talking about lots of facts and numbers and things like that, and it's a little dry sometimes. And so this is going to be my lame attempt at getting some humor into this. This is Kermit the Frog. He says, why do people say, I saw it with my own eyes? Do they sometimes use other people's eyes? I know, really funny, right? Well, it was a lame attempt. I had to try to do something. So eyes, though, there's a reason for the eyes. Because we're going to talk about something called eyewitness testimony. This is J. Warner Wallace. He was instrumental in my journey. Cold case detective for many years, 20 to 30 years, solved some of the toughest, hardest crimes. He's been on Dateline many times. Strong atheist, or at least he was. Like myself, he went to church for his wife. One day the pastor said, Jesus is the smartest man that ever lived. Jim, what? What? I got to check that out. So he got a New Testament, started looking at it, said to his wife, this kind of sounds like eyewitness testimony. So he started using his cold case detective skills. Events are in the distant past. There's no living eyewitnesses, and the forensic evidence, if any, is gone. Same thing he does in the cold cases. And he wrote a book called Cold Case Christianity, which was a game changer for me. Because it gave me a lens I hadn't seen before, that the writers of the Gospels are either eyewitnesses themselves or they are writing on account of an eyewitness. They weren't following this on faith. They were following it on what they saw, at least what they said they saw. And eyewitness testimony is evidence in a court of law. There's no doubt that they claim to be eyewitnesses. It's all over the place. We've seen, we've heard, we've looked, we've touched ourselves. And we talked earlier about the inconsistencies across the copies. Well, here was another problem I had as a skeptic. What about the inconsistencies across the stories? Luke writes it differently than John does or than Matthew does. These were eyewitnesses. They saw it. Shouldn't they be the same? Obviously, they're making this up. Here's one more short video. Warner Wallace talking about that inconsistency problem I just brought up.
I never flinched for a minute on the differences I saw between accounts. That didn't bother me. I had other issues, but that wasn't one of them. And I'll tell you why. Because by this time, at 35, I had been working multiple eyewitness accounts for nearly a decade. And I realized early on that no two eyewitnesses ever agree. Ever. It could happen right now. It could happen while we're creating this tape. And you know that you'll get two witnesses who will disagree about what happened 5 minutes ago. This happens all the time. There's variation between the resurrection accounts, absolutely. And that gave me great confidence because it's exactly the kind of variation I would expect to see if the resurrection accounts are real eyewitness accounts. And yes, they vary exactly to the degree I would expect them to.
I had to cut it short, so. So the differences actually should be expected. And here's another reason they should be expected. They're writing to a different audience for a different purpose. Mark's writing to the Romans, Matthew to the Jews, Luke to the Greeks, John to unbelievers, with a different purpose in mind. So of course they're going to tell the stories a bit differently to try to reach the audience that they're trying to reach. So inconsistencies actually point to true eyewitness testimony. So as I kind of sum up this section, I said, hey, there's good evidence this is authentic. Number one, we have many manuscripts, we have a short time gap, we have insignificant differences, and the writers were eyewitnesses at the time of the event. Now you might notice there's some numbers missing there. Go 1, 2, 4, 5, and that's because there's some evidence that we're just not going to have time to talk about. Number 3 is the disciples' writings. So the early disciples, the early church fathers, wrote themselves, and we have copies of what they wrote. And they actually quote the New Testament. So it actually fills in that time gap a bit. We have an early belief. If you look into the evidence, you can actually trace back. They think that early belief, the Christianity belief of the resurrection, can go back to weeks from when Jesus was crucified. And finally, number 7, there's evidence, particularly the great Isaiah scroll and some other things, that the scribes are meticulous and were extremely accurate. That leaves me with the resurrection. Crucial to Christianity. But that's got to be made up, right? It's a miracle. I don't know. I guess I have to look at it. Well, the eyewitnesses, this is the way to look at it. They said they saw the resurrected Jesus. So not what somebody told them, what they saw. So if they say they saw that, you have to find an explanation that accounts for the start of Christianity and what they say. There are some other theories out there. There's the theory that he was revived later after the cross, that he faked his death, he didn't actually die on a crucifixion, that somebody died in his place, there was an imposter. His body was simply moved after the fact. Wrong grave. They went to the wrong grave after the crucifixion, or maybe his body was just discarded. Well, quite great. There's these other most popular theories. These theories all have problems amongst themselves. They don't explain all the evidence. But there's a reason they all fail together. Because remember what I said? They said they saw. That means they lied. If any of these explanations are true, the disciples, the eyewitnesses, are lying about what they saw. We can look at that. Does that seem reasonable? Warner Wallace, again, in all his crimes, says there's 3 reasons people lie: greed, sexual desire, and power. That's the reason people lie. So we look at the eyewitnesses. They rejected all their material wealth, gave it away as a matter of fact. There's no record in any writings, Christian or secular, of any sexual stuff. There's no hint of it. Many of them were celibate. And they died, or at least suffered, for their belief. Now, skeptic. You'll hear me say that a lot. Mr. Skeptic. Lots of people die for what they believe. 9/11 is a great example, right? They died for what they believed. So what's so special? Well, they died for what they read or what they've been told. These folks died for what they say they saw. That is a big difference. If they did lie, that means they made this up. Listen to some of the things they made up that they would have to follow. If you lust with your eyes, you've committed adultery. If someone strikes you on your right cheek, give them the other. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Don't store up treasures. Paul says we hunger, we thirst, we're poorly clothed, we're roughly treated, we're homeless, we labor, working with our own hands. Doesn't seem like the kind of story I would make up. And they never flinched in all those years. As I was doing this investigation, you can put this test to other religious leaders. And let me just say, they don't fare very well. And if they lied, it means it was a conspiracy because it's more than one person lying. And there's some elements to a successful conspiracy. I have the ability to communicate, make sure no one lied or fessed up. Short time span, harder to keep a lie, obviously, longer. Strong relationships, family members make the best, and little pressure to confess. So, what do we see with the eyewitnesses? Primitive methods, obviously in the first century. It lasted for decades. They never flinched. Many of them were complete strangers. Many of them were persecuted and had a lot of pressure to confess. So that doesn't add up either. There is one theory left that we have to talk about. It's the hallucination theory. Because if they did hallucinate, if they thought they saw it, then they wouldn't be lying, right? But there's some obvious problems with this theory. The first one is multiple people having the same hallucination on multiple occasions in multiple different places. Never been heard of before. And if it did happen, it almost seems like that would kind of be a miracle, which is what we're trying to disprove. It doesn't account for the empty tomb. That's the big one. If they hallucinated this, if they thought they saw Jesus, they could have gone down to the tomb and seen that, nope, his body is still here. That's probably the biggest one. Then there's a story I read about the Navy SEALs. They go through grueling training for days, sleep deprived, get no sleep at all. They end up in cold water to the point they hallucinate. They're in it together. Same thing, but none of their hallucinations are even close to the same. You can make up alternative theories all day long. It doesn't change what they say they saw. And what they say they saw changed the world. Became the biggest religion on earth. It's the best explanation for the evidence. So you may have noticed these are puzzle pieces. We talked about the Bible, facts behind the Bible, it's authentic, the resurrection. And that's because there's other pieces to the puzzle that we didn't talk about. Whole topic about that radical change I talked about and how dramatic it was. Over the years, all the arts and the science and everything we have, if you go back and look, it's due to Christianity. We talked about the Bible as a source. But there is unfriendly, I call it, unfriendly evidence, secular sources, people against Christianity who wrote about it, and we have their writings. So we can look at that, and that's pretty unusual in ancient times. I talked about the disciples and that they wrote things as well. Eyewitnesses, there's 4 other tests that you can put to eyewitnesses to see if they're telling a trustworthy story, and they pass them. Miracles. If you look at miracles, I think if you look for it, there's miracles that have happened, and they're still happening. They're hard to see, but that's the definition of a miracle. Resurrection, of course, being the biggest miracle of all. And then unique. Christianity, when I looked at the other religions, Christianity is unique. And by the way, all religions, all of them, make exclusive claims. They can't all be right. They could all be wrong, including Christianity. That's possible. But they can't all be right because they all make exclusive claims. So Christianity is unique among many things. The divinity, the salvation, how you don't have to earn salvation, prophecy, and the fact that I talked about those testing the leaders, it rises above the other leaders in the other religions. And when you start a puzzle, you start with the edge pieces. So if you take these pieces, you can make the edge of the puzzle. But you'll notice there's at least one piece that's missing. There's another piece that didn't fit. There's lots of that, actually, right? There are pieces that don't fit. It's not an airtight story. But it's cumulative, it's coherent, and when you put it all together, it's the most reasonable explanation, and it fills in the puzzle that it's got to be true. So if I go back to my journey, if I go back to my struggle, I didn't know, do I give in? Because as you all probably know, this is a life change and it's not easy. I have to forgive, serve others. I have to love my neighbors. I don't even like some of my neighbors, and now I have to love them? My thoughts, I have to clean up my thoughts. And I have another problem. I have a fear that prevents me from making decisions. I like to share some other fears for fun before I get to my fear. And the first one I talk about is the fear of chickens. It's a real fear. Allochtophobia. There's a fear, believe it or not, of peanut butter sticking to the roof of your mouth. Now, I can't pronounce that one, so it's an actual fear. And the last fear for fun, and this is my favorite, there is a fear, somehow, somewhere, some way, somehow, right now, your fear is you're being watched by a duck. That is a real fear. But my fear is the fear of being wrong. And it paralyzes me. If I buy something online or wherever, I'm always worried the next day it's going to go on sale. I was wrong. I'm wrong about everything. I'm a second guesser. So I had to decide what to do about that. And I went back to law enforcement. And I went back to jury instructions because I figure I'm a juror. I'm evaluating evidence. I have atheist side, I'm looking at their explanation. I have the theist side, the Christians and their explanation for the same evidence, by the way. That's what jurors do. They look at the same evidence, they hear the explanations, and they decide which one's better. So our jury instructions, they say a reasonable doubt is a doubt based on reason and common sense. It is not required that the government prove guilt beyond all possible doubt. That's an unreasonable standard. It says, if you are convinced beyond a reasonable doubt the defendant is guilty, it's your duty to find the defendant guilty. So I just changed the words a little bit. If I am convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that Christianity is true, then it's my duty to find Christianity true. Recall my twins back in 2007. This is what started the journey. In 2011, finally giving in, I was baptized. Thank you. I was all in. I led small groups. I cleaned up my playlists. I cleaned up my language. I cleaned up my library. I did my best to clean up my thoughts. But that fear, it gripped me again. It's about 2015, and I'm around as Christians now, right? Did I really give everything a fair shot? Did I really, really do it well? So I went back in. I dug back in a bit secretively. And I got to this point, and you may have been there too. I'm listening to podcasts and debates, and I find myself saying, I've heard that, I've heard that, I've heard that. This is nothing new. This is nothing new. And I got to that point where everything just seemed to be repetitive. And that's when I decided, well, I'm back to where I started. That the best explanation is Christianity is true. Here's what I want to leave you with tonight. Don't let emotions overrule evidence. Remember Rhett and Link? So, you can listen to their story. It's on YouTube. They both talk about over an hour, so like an hour and a half. I listened to both of them a couple times to try to understand why they deconstructed. They were part of Crew, very, very religious, very Christian. Well, when I listened to it, remember, it's emotions. Their reasons were primarily emotional. Rhett repeated many times, if I don't have to believe, that's emotional. I'm more attracted to, emotional. I'm angry with Christians who deceived me. That's emotional. A reoccurring theme in Link's was his discouragement, trying to live a Christian life. These are emotions, and emotions are hard. I'm not discounting them, because I have emotions too. I mean, there's lots of times I don't really want to be a Christian. And I still struggle. I still have doubts. But you can't let emotions overrule the evidence. I didn't become a Christian because it was easy. And again, there's times I really don't want to be a Christian. I became a Christian because of the evidence, and I can't let my emotions overrule that. So I hope I've encouraged you today to think about your worldview this way, to think about evidence, because there is good evidence there. And whatever it is, even if you're a skeptic, even if you're not a Christian, maybe take the time to look at the evidence. If it's true, which I think it is, there's more to life, there's more than the materials you're made of, and what you do with this life actually matters.